Hello, and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Marielle Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. Welcome to episode 30. Today, Ed and I break down step by step all the different things that happen when we have an emotion. We recorded this episode earlier this year, pre-pandemic. We just didn't have a chance to air it until now. Everything we talk about is still applicable to understanding emotions, and we hope you find it helpful. Just a bit of a warning, the audio is a bit wonky in some parts of this recording, and hopefully it's not too distracting as you listen. So today we're going to be talking about what happens when you have an emotion, and we'll be delving into DBT's model for describing emotions. Because when we have an emotion, we are usually just in it. We're feeling the joy, the anger, the sadness, whatever it is. But there's actually a whole bunch of different components that constitute that emotion.
One of the things I appreciate about the DBT model for describing emotions is the ability to really slow down and break down what's happening when we have emotions, which is so important as a foundation for all of our work on emotion regulation, is having an understanding of what's happening. And even though when we're in an emotion, we're mostly just feeling it, I think it can be really helpful, especially after the fact, to go back and really slow it down and see that having emotions is actually really multiple stages of things going on at one time. So rather than, oh my God, I was so overwhelmed, it's like, oh no, this happened, which gives us a lot more ability to figure out what we might do to manage that emotion more effectively in the future.
Yeah, and that sort of intellectual understanding of all the different parts that go into making up our emotion, I think can give us a sense of control, even if we can't do it right in the moment. But if we do this we go through this sort of model of describing emotions enough times, when we're in an emotion, we might be able to reflect, oh, yes, my heart's beating fast, or I'm having this kind of change in my system, or I'm having this interpretation. And that can be so helpful in bringing down some of these really distressing emotions that a lot of us struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
So as we said, a lot of things are happening when we have emotions, and emotions are responses to what's happening around us. And the language we use in DBT is a prompting event. So this can be anything. Suppose we read a news article and we have an emotion. Maybe we feel anger or fear, or we walk into work Monday morning and a coworker doesn't greet us and we have an emotion in response to that. So those are things that sort of happen outside of us, but things can also happen more internally. So maybe we remember something from the past that brings up an emotion that maybe brings up happiness or grief, or we have a body sensation that can bring up an emotion. I know often when I am getting sick, I can feel really sad, and I can get the two confused because they can feel so similar in me. And I'm getting sick or I'm coming down with something, I'll think, oh no, am I getting depressed?
Right.
Because they can feel so similar. So it can be a prompting event, can be anything that's happening outside of us or inside of us.
Right.
And I feel like if you really pay attention, you're likely having a lot of emotions all day, every day, especially if you're more emotionally sensitive, which we've talked about in an earlier episode.
Yeah. So that when we tend to experience our emotions strongly, then we are going to really relate to this idea of like emotions that just kind of well up. And if we break them down, we can see what's exactly going on and give it a little bit more what we call in DBT the reasonable mind balance to that emotion.
Yes. So let's break down let's break it down because there's 10 parts to this model for describing emotions, or 10 components. For the first one, which I talked about a moment ago, it is a prompting event. So the prompting event is anything that happens, anything outside of you, anything inside of you. Just this morning, I smelled coffee brewing, and that makes me feel happy.
Mm-hmm.
That's a prompting event. I was out this weekend, and this is something I don't smell very often in the Bay Area of California, but someone was smoking. And I don't know if this is an emotion really, but I had an emotion of nostalgia or longing, like a memory. And it was very positive.
Yeah.
And then right after that, and we'll talk about this because there's secondary emotions, I had shame.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not supposed to be having a positive emotion about someone smoking a cigarette.
Right.
And if any of my friends knew, they would judge me. So we'll go into secondary emotions. Are you a former smoker?
I am, and I know exactly what you're talking about because again, in 2020, it's like so rare, but like I do have the same like, and then, like immediately like, oh my God.
Yeah, it could be really strong. So these things happen really automatically and often without a lot of conscious thought that something will happen and you'll have a response.
So maybe to talk a little bit about the idea of secondary emotions, which is an emotion that is a response to the original emotion. So noticing the cigarette smell and having an emotion of happiness maybe or nostalgia, and then noticing that emotion and having an emotion of shame that follows it. So sometimes it can become confusing because we can have secondary emotions so quickly after the original that we don't even notice the original. But that it is, like something that can happen as a cascade of emotions in a way.
Yeah, and I think that's when we wind up saying or hearing people talk about, like, I just feel bad. And you
Right.
can't really explain what it is because things happen quickly. So maybe you got angry at someone and then right after you had a secondary emotion of shame, or I shouldn't have gotten so angry at them, or of sadness. This anger means I'm maybe going to lose this relationship. And that's when we can hear people just feeling overwhelmed. And I just saying things like, I just feel bad and I don't know what's going on.
And that's where I think that this opportunity to really try to observe and describe our emotions and break them down is so valuable. So that rather than, I just feel bad, which what are you supposed to do with that? We can notice, like, oh, I feel shame. Oh, the shame is from feeling happy about smelling cigarette smoke. Okay, let me break all of this down. And
Yeah.
that can be so much more helpful than just kind of like experiencing emotions and being overwhelmed.
Yes. Do you want to talk about the second component of an emotion?
Yes. So the first part of observing emotions is noticing the prompting event, whatever it is internally or externally that prompted that emotion. And the second part is to actually bring our attention and awareness to the emotion so that we're noticing that we're having an emotion.
And the reason why, I mean, it might seem sort of obvious, if something happens and we're not aware of it, obviously we're not going to have a response. And I think the reason why we talk about this in DBT is because some of the distress tolerance skills can come in at the stage. So a thing happens that brings up an emotion. Let's say it's a distressing emotion. You can use distraction, for example, to shift your awareness or attention away from the thing that's upsetting you.
And with emotion regulation, we're actually trying to shift our awareness to that emotion, to that prompting event, to all of this, because we want to be working with the emotion. With distress tolerance, the emotion could be too overwhelming and we don't want to risk becoming overwhelmed. So we do things to kind of take our mind off of it. With emotion regulation, we are trying to really focus on that second part, which is awareness, noticing, observing, using kind of our mindfulness skills of observing and describing. So non-judgmentally, just being aware of what is the emotion, what am I experiencing?
Yes. And then the next step, or step three, is, and this is the part where I feel all the intense, painful stuff comes up, or this is the part that really trips myself and I feel like many other people up. It's the interpretation of the event. So something happens, we're aware of it clearly, and then we have some kind of interpretation, which means we have thoughts or beliefs, some kind of response to the thing that happened. So we make meaning of the event, we make assumptions, we make judgments. And this is where a lot of the painful stuff comes up. And this relates to a skill that we've talked about previously called check the facts, because very often some of our most intractable, painful emotions are about the interpretation of the thing that happens.
Right. And being able to recognize that we are always having emotions, like it's just happening constantly without us even noticing it. We're also having interpretations immediately. Like this is just how our brains are built. So we're noticing something, we're having an interpretation. Sometimes that interpretation is based on what's actually happening in the situation. Oftentimes it's based on past experiences, our own model of how the world works, our sense of self that can sometimes be not really based in the facts of the situation. So, being able to examine and notice what are my interpretations of this emotion can help us to see if there's something we need to maybe work with a little bit more.
So I think what you're talking about here, Ed, leads us into step 4, which is looking at vulnerability factors. So the thing happens, we have some kind of interpretation, and then we want to look at things in our life that might make us more vulnerable, particularly to feeling some of the more painful emotions. So it can be things in our recent past, or things from our distant past. So things maybe from the more recent past that could make us more vulnerable to feeling or getting really stuck in a painful emotion might have to do with our physical well-being. Like, are you tired or sick or in pain? Maybe you're hungover or you haven't eaten in a while. So those are maybe more recent kind of physical things, but also things from our distant past. So from our childhoods, from our family of origin, that might make us very vulnerable to um, having a more negative interpretation of an event that happened. So, for example, often events that happen in our present day lives can really push buttons from our past. So, we interpret or read things through those past experiences. So, for example, if you're going through a breakup, which is very painful for almost everyone, but you came from a family where there are multiple divorces, this or that breakup might impact you in a different way. It might hit a particularly painful nerve for you.
And, another example for me that I've talked before on the podcast is like if I'm feeling kind of frustrated or worried and I'm having a strong response and someone says to me, calm down, like my anger is going to shoot up immediately. And I may not even notice that my anger has shot up because when people used to tell me to calm down when I was young, that would make me so angry because if I could calm down, I would. Um,
Yeah.
so the words calm down are a huge trigger for me still to this day. And so, like I may not even notice that all of a sudden I'm furious. And it's because I got kind of thrown back into being an overwhelmed child who was being given unhelpful suggestions.
And this is where knowing our own stories and our own vulnerability factors is so important. So getting familiar with the things that, push our buttons from the past, and we each have unique stories around this. So you hear someone say, calm down, and that's going to set off a whole cascade of secondary emotions and responses that it wouldn't necessarily in someone else. And I think this points to, the value of really delving into some of our past history.
Right. Because the more we can understand about those vulnerability factors, again, for me, if I'm sick, I am going to be so much more vulnerable to really strong emotions. And so when I am sick, because I know that, if I all of a sudden I'm feeling like really, really, really frustrated, I'm like, okay, you're sick. I'm like, hold on, slow this down, rather than being just diving into it and saying, yes, I should be frustrated. And so I think that being able to understand ourselves, understand our vulnerability factors to strong emotion, both short term and from our distant past, can be so helpful.
Yeah. And as we're talking, I'm feeling like we didn't do interpretation justice. And I feel like I want us to just tease that apart. So if we could jump back to what was that, step 3, the interpretation. Because for me, I don't know if you feel the same way, Ed. I feel like this is like the area where we really can get some traction when we can start teasing apart people's interpretations of prompting events.
Yeah, I think that so much of where emotions are painful is in the interpretations. Being able to slow things down and notice all these other factors is really important and valuable. Oftentimes, the work of changing the emotion is in examining the interpretation.
And I want to give an example here to help illustrate what we're talking about. So, a pretty commonplace one, say you text a friend to get together and several days go by and you don't hear back from them. I mean, different people could go in a lot of different directions with what kind of meaning they make of this or what kind of interpretation they make. So if you perhaps have a history or have a vulnerability factor of feeling abandoned or not loved well, you might go to sadness or hurt, like they don't care about me. If you have a vulnerability factor that's more around conflict, where conflict has been a scary or dangerous thing, you might think, oh, they're clearly mad at me. I must have done something to upset them.
And there would be a really different response if your interpretation is, oh, they're just really busy. So maybe you might
Yes.
be frustrated that they didn't get back, but there's a big difference between they're really busy and they hate me. And so like that's another interpretation, which you don't know. We're making it up. We don't know what happened. We just know they didn't respond to the text. So there's a range of what our response might be.
Yeah. And the reason why I wanted to just emphasize this point more is because we spend a lot of time talking about checking the facts with folks in our DBT skills group, because this is the area where people run into trouble and experience so many painful emotions. And then I feel like can start a whole cascade of events that could be avoided because the thing happened. So those are the facts. That's why we have the skill called check the facts. Like I text my friend, I didn't hear back from them. And if you make these assumptions or interpretations and you run with it, like they clearly don't care about me. Maybe you send a text even though you haven't heard from them, like, I guess our friendship is over, or right? Like you could really escalate
Right,
this.
right. One of the things that often people will say is like, oh, I'm really working on my emotion regulation. So when I notice that I'm having uncomfortable emotions, I try to find a positive interpretation. But that's also an interpretation. So they hate me would be a negative interpretation. They're just really busy is a maybe more positive. But what if they're actually mad at me and they're not saying it?
Right.
They didn't respond to my text. That's all I know. And
Yeah.
making the assumption of like, oh, you're just really busy is actually may not be any more effective than making the assumption of like, I guess our friendship is over.
Right. That's a great point that it's not positive interpretations feel better in the moment, but we don't really know.
Right.
That's why we really want to stay with the facts that we do know and to watch some of those stories that we can spin out until we have information.
Right.
And so we talked about the prompting event, about being aware of it. That's step one and two, or component one and two of this model for describing emotion. Three was our interpretation. And then four, which we already did, was our vulnerability factors. And then five is our biological changes.
I think it's helpful in the process of kind of slowing things down and really examining what's happening when we have any kind of strong emotion is to notice all of the subtle changes within us when we are experiencing an emotion. So, any emotion is going to have a biological component to it. Our emotions really hit lots of parts of our brains and our nervous systems. Like we want to kind of notice what is the physiological response to this emotion. Am I noticing tension in my shoulders? Am I noticing heaviness in my heart? Am I noticing a desire, like tears kind of welling up? Just noticing what are those biological changes.
Yes, because when we're having emotions, it impacts many parts of our brains and our nervous system. So, our sympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system which has the like our ability to act under times of high stress. So this is the fight, flight, and freeze response.
Very good.
Yes.
We sometimes struggle with the fight, flight, flight, blight, flight.
Right. What is it? So we want to fight, we want to run,
Yes.
or we freeze.
Right.
And even when we freeze, like our heart rate is up, our blood
Yes.
pressure is high, we might be sweating. We probably breathe more shallowly and rapidly. So we sort of have this bolt of energy for action.
Right. And again, that's where, for instance, if that sympathetic nervous system kicks in and we have this like momentum physically for some sort of action, even if it's freezing, but with like real tension, that's where oftentimes people will turn to target behaviors to escape that intensity of emotion. So using substances to numb out that kind of emotion, self-harm, totally just checking out. All of those are things that could be a response to that really strong nervous system response.
Yeah, that's so much is happening in our bodies when we have an emotion that it makes sense for folks to go towards something that alters the body in some way
Right.
or alters the body chemistry so you can feel something different for a little bit. And we also know that there are ways that we can do that that are helpful to us and harmful to us. And I think a big piece of learning to regulate your emotions more is becoming more aware of and skilled at sensing all those changes in your body that come with different emotions. And this is very challenging if you spent a lifetime of not living in your body and shutting off information from it. So this might mean that you live in your head more and you've kind of tried to dissociate from your body due to trauma or other things that have happened that have made living in your body feel not safe. And I think on this note, telling yourself or someone else to just stop feeling an emotion is kind of useless because we can't will ourselves to not feel something. We certainly can use different kind of skills, like I talked about earlier, like we can distract our attention away from something or check the facts. We can challenge our interpretation or judgments of an event. These are all ways to change what you're feeling, but you can't through sheer willpower not feel what you're feeling. And this is, I think, also ties back in with what you said earlier with your trigger, Ed, when you were told to calm down when you were young. Like you couldn't just do that
Right.
on command.
And even as a child, I knew,
Right.
Even though I couldn't put words to it. But like I think that this is such a common response to emotion is just stop having it. And if it was that easy, we would just do that and there would be no Skillful podcast.
I don't know if I've shared this story on the podcast before, and forgive me if I have, but I remember when my niece was really little, and I don't know what she did, but she got in trouble, and she was in her room, and she was really upset. She was in her bed, and I was in the room somehow too, or I came in there, I think, with my sister, and my sister was like, "You can come out when you calm down." And she got up on the edge of her bed, and like her face was bright red, and her hands were in fists, and she screamed at the top of her lungs, "I'm calm!" Poor thing. She needed some help calming her system down.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so should we talk about our next component? After biological changes. So these are all the things happening in your nervous system and your neurons firing in your brain. So then we have the actual experience, which is what we talked about, the body sensation or the feeling. And I realize we've been using the word emotion and feeling interchangeably, which is probably not entirely accurate. So here I would say the emotion is the actual emotion that happened, and the feeling is the thing that happens in your body, the thing that you sense that accompanies the emotion. And with that, we also often have action urges, which we had also mentioned. If it's a trauma response, maybe it's to fight back or to run away or to freeze or hide, or a whole myriad of other action urges that come with the biological changes. Like with shame, I feel like that's an emotion that really wants to get us to hide
Right.
and kind of retreat into ourselves. Sadness also has action urges and bodily sensations, often of low energy or withdrawal.
So when we notice in the kind of the fifth component, the biological changes, and then in the sixth component, kind of what that action urge might be or the experience of those biological changes in the emotion, the seventh component would be the expression of all of that. So our facial expression, our body language. Because when we talk about emotions, we recognize that emotions are meant biologically to communicate information to ourselves and to others. So for all emotions, there are like a biological component about communicating outward what emotion we're experiencing. So noticing the expression of whatever that emotion is. What's my facial expression? What's my body language? If I'm really angry, I probably have a really furrowed brow and my fists might be really tight. If I'm afraid, I might have really wide eyes and be quieter or actually physically retreating. Kind of noticing, how is this emotion being expressed outward?
Yes, and this is also a pretty important place to intervene to change your emotion if that's what you're trying to do. Because if you can change your facial expression and how you're holding your body, you might be able to change how you feel.
So, one of the skills that we talk about for distress tolerance is the half smile, willing hands, which is all about physically changing our posture in a way that's going to promote more acceptance and openness. So, if I'm feeling really angry and I have tight fists, opening up my hands into like that kind of open, willing hands posture will communicate like it's okay to be open. And that can change that emotional response.
Yeah, so if you're feeling sort of dejected or bad about yourself, and I know I've experienced this and I've seen it in others, and maybe we're slumping, kind of, holding our heads down a little bit, and sometimes just sitting up straight and holding your head up and kind of looking around, that can shift things.
Right. So, and kind of continuing with looking at all the different components of an emotional experience, following up those kind of body expressions is our action. So, like we said, there's an action urge that comes with emotions. So, part 8 would be, what actions do we take? Are we, kind of like jumping up and down for joy if we're really happy? Are we starting to run away, like literally like hustling away if we're scared? Noticing what action urges do we have and what actions do we take?
Yes. And then the ninth component, as we're going through all this following actions, is the emotion name, or this would be the place where we'd want to think about naming the emotion, which has to do again with awareness. And sometimes just naming your emotion can be helpful in changing what you're feeling because it requires you to access a different part of your brain and to become really aware of what's going on with you. And that in and of itself can sometimes shift things and bring down the intensity of an emotion. If instead of just being in it and maybe in a blind rage to say, oh, I'm really angry right now,
Right.
that can be really helpful.
So often when we are experiencing strong emotions, we can have this shorthand of like, oh, I feel upset or I feel miserable or feel fury or whatever. But being able to say, I actually feel guilt. That can help us. And again, it's bringing in that reasonable mind side of our minds to balance out the experience of the emotion because we need both, right? So being able to experience all of these physical sensations and everything that goes with the emotion, but then bringing in the reasonable mind to name it. This is anger. This is fear. This is sadness.
And then our final component in our model for describing emotion is the after effects. So, strong emotions can have ripple effects on our memory, our ability to think clearly, how our bodies feel, and our behavior. We want to be aware of kind of the, hangover or the after effects of having a strong emotion.
Yeah, one of the things that people will talk about is that emotions love themselves. And so we can often have this like, kind of repetitive experience of emotions. Because like once the emotion is there, oftentimes we just keep going back to it, and that can sometimes cause us difficulties if we're kind of getting paralyzed with grief. We need, if we've lost someone or something that's important to us, we do need to grieve. But if we kind of notice that there's like a really strong pull towards more grief, we can notice maybe we need to mix things up a little bit in order to maintain a balance.
Yes, and coming on the heels of the after effects is also where the secondary emotions can come in. Where, with this example of grieving, maybe you feel like you can't sort of move through the grief in a way you'd like to. So then you start having a lot of shame or self-judgment, or maybe you get really angry at yourself or at the person who died or left you. So there's another emotion that can come on the heel of the primary emotion.
So, to maybe bring this all together, all of these ways of observing and noticing and naming our emotions, using an example and walking through this 10-part reflection process might be helpful. So, Marielle, I think you have an example, a recent example of a strong emotion.
Yes. So I felt, should I start with what the emotion is?
Let's start with the prompting event and kind of I'll walk you through it maybe. So, what was the prompting event?
I was driving and someone was, the right term, tailgating. They were like right, like dangerously behind me, and then they honked.
Yeah. So that
Yeah.
was the prompting event. And what were you aware of?
I was aware of how close they were, and I looked in my rear view mirror and I saw them sort of scowling, and then I heard the honk.
And what were you aware of kind of within you just in that first moment?
I felt fear and I started to feel anger.
And then for part 3, what were your interpretations of what was happening?
It happened so quickly, as often happens with emotions, but if I try to think back and break it down, I mean, it happened so fast and I took an action, which I will tell you about. But my interpretation was kind of like, this person is a threat.
Right, right. Which is a pretty strong interpretation.
Yes.
Now that you look back, are you aware of vulnerability factors?
Yes. So I was having a lot of things happen in my life that were making me vulnerable to be pretty reactive. And so there were two things. One was I was having this kind of intractable conflict in my relationship that was going on for a little while that wasn't easy to resolve. Eventually we did, but when this happened in the car, it was not yet resolved. And so I had some anger that was building in me that didn't really have an outlet. And then at the same time that was happening, I was having some chronic pain flare up.
Mm.
And I was having such a hard time sleeping. So I hadn't slept well for quite a few days. So I would say both those things were making me vulnerable to be more reactive.
So a lot of vulnerability factors that would definitely intensify emotion. What did you notice in terms of biological changes?
Again, it happens really fast, but if I try to break it down, I feel like my heart started to beat more quickly. You know that expression, seeing red? I didn't actually see red, but I had that sort of sensation where I was just sort of flooded with anger, and I felt my muscles go really tense.
Yeah, so a lot of like emotion, like biological changes, emotional experience, right?
Hmm.
Um, and did you notice any action urges?
You know, I took an action, which I'm embarrassed, but I'm going to tell you about it. So, but you wanted me to just stay with the urge. So there was probably an urge, but I didn't. I just acted on it.
Okay. And what was what if someone was looking at you, what would they have seen in terms of your facial expression, your body language as an expression of this emotion?
I think I was kind of hunched over the wheel. I was definitely kind of scowled back. I think I slowed down.
Yeah.
And then in the rearview mirror, so he could see, I gave him the finger.
So your action was that you gave him the finger.
Yes.
Right. And so what emotion would you say was the primary emotion there?
I was angry.
And were there secondary emotions as well?
They came later.
Okay, so
in that moment, I was just angry.
Okay, and then so number 10, what are the after effects?
The after effect, it actually turned out lovely, which I will tell you in a minute. But the after effects, I think normally if I did something like that, and I don't do that often, but I think I'd feel embarrassed and ashamed if I reacted so strongly. But so I just want to tell you the story because then the after effect was something that I wouldn't have anticipated. So the guy, I think I switched lanes, or somehow we wound up, instead of him behind me, we were side by side in a not very busy street and stuck at a light. So I saw him sort of pull up beside me and he rolled down his window and I was still angry and I was for a fight, which is not like me. Like I rolled down my window. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. And he starts yelling at me. Why'd you give me the finger? Why'd you do that? Blah, blah, blah. I said, you were behind me. You were honking at me. He was like, you were going too slow. I said I was trying to switch lanes. I couldn't get in. Like we were going back and forth. It's a long light. And he said, well, you shouldn't have flipped me off. And I said, you shouldn't have honked at me. And then I said, this is unbelievable. And it gives me faith in strangers and humanity. I said, you know what? You're right. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. And he said, I'm sorry too. Have a good day. And not like obnoxiously, like he meant it. And like we rolled up our windows and we drove away. And I was like, oh, that went well.
Yeah.
So that this is a long way of saying the after effect for me afterwards, like, oh, I was like, I think I need to go home and take a nap. I'm really kind of a bit fried and I'm acting in ways that feel out of character and I don't like.
Right. So all of that happened so quickly in the matter of minutes and had a big impact. Luckily had positive after effects, but could have equally had negative ones. But by really breaking it down, you can notice so much. And in your case, be able to notice what you need and what will be helpful and how to respond to all of this intense emotion in a way that is going to move you in the direction you want to go instead of just going wherever the emotions are going to take you.
Absolutely. And so if anyone is listening, I'm sure we've all had the experience of having, especially with something like anger, but with many emotions, it happens really fast. So if you can lead yourself through this step by step with following the 10 different components that we laid out, or ideally even reading along in the DBT skills handouts and worksheets that we'll link to in the show notes, you can see it laid out there in a really nice way. You can start to feel some mastery and control over your emotional reactions.
And for me, I find it helpful if I've had a really strong emotional experience to go through this and break it down for myself because it does help me see things in a different way. It brings in more of the reasonable mind in order to balance out the emotion because I'm really being inquisitive about what happened. And again, it's so helpful to have an orientation to learning from our experiences instead of, oh, I was so over emotional, I'm just a bad person. It's like, how can I learn from this in a way that helps me in the future?
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at bayarea.dbtcc.com. That's bayarea.dbtcc.com.